The discussion of video games as a form of art is something that I remember a lot as a child. Of course, back in those days, games looked a lot more like this. Granted, this is a singular example. I'm not trying to argue that video games aren't art, rather the opposite. The point here is that as an outside observer, especially if you're one who primarily encounters video games by looking at your children, it's something you could easily see as nothing more than a distraction. It's hard to cram meaningful and cohesive stories into something like an NES cartridge or a DS cartridge, so you just don't do that. But technology lets us put more and more meaningful and complex worlds into a singular game. Now, a story is not the only thing that would make video games art, but I do think it's a helpful bridge to cross that gap. If your game is about something, if it contains a story, then there's very little that separates it from a movie, aside from the level of input you have as the player. The fascinating thing about video games is the level of flexibility you have when it comes to their structure. With other mediums, you have a number of rules to follow if you want to create a work of that type. Sure, you can make movies without a narrative structure, and people have, but many of them are relegated to art house style projects that people don't really experience, even if they know about them. The first project that comes to mind is Andy Warhol's Empire, which is an 8-hour film of the Empire State Building. While the project is significant for what it is, few people have actually seen the film, and fewer still in its entirety. Any movie made for mass public consumption has to have some form of story going for it. Nobody really intends to sit down and watch nothing happen. Games are unique in that a narrative is not a prerequisite for widespread appeal, as the added layer of involvement means that you can invest a player for reasons other than simply to see what will unfold. Many classic arcade games simply use a scoring system as an incentive to keep players playing, shooting to achieve the highest score against a group of their peers. In a similar vein, the goal can just be to defeat your opponent with technical knowledge or strategy, the foundation of literally every game that pits players against one another since the dawn of time. But it's from this massive versatility that my interest in analyzing the types of narrative in video games comes from. And where better to discuss that than my very own YouTube channel. So today, we're going to take a look at some of my favorite stories, or lack thereof, in gaming, as we talk about the art of the narrative. I think there's nowhere more fitting to start than a lack of story. This is especially common, as I already spoke about, in classic arcade games. You don't really need a story to understand Pong, okay? There are limitless examples of games such as these, but the one I wanted to talk about was Dystopika. This game is interesting to me because it barely qualifies as a game. It's more of a wallpaper builder than anything, only made appealing to me because of the genre that it sits in. I love me some retrowave / cyberpunk, and getting to build my very own Night City has a very massive appeal. The whole game is simply about you placing down buildings and decorations to shape the city to your liking. Unlike other city building games, there's no resource system here. There's nothing we're trying to manage. No population to keep happy, no water to keep clean, power to generate, nothing. You simply place buildings, change the design, then place some more buildings. Every so often you'll unlock new buildings to place until eventually the game will have given you all of them, and you're left to your own devices. I tried my hand at really making my own city, but it turns out I can cross City Planner off my list of backup plans in case my current job ends up not working out. This feels a lot like building with Legos in that there's no clear goal or anything to maintain, except you have an infinite amount of digital Legos. Even Minecraft has more of a story than this game. Now, there may not contain a story or even an objective, but to say that nothing is going on here would be a lie. The setting still gives us some context as to what goes on in this world. Many of the buildings sport company names on them, and the shape and size indicates to us that this is clearly some kind of dystopia. I mean, it's in the fucking name. The closest the game will ever get to a story is the one you create in your head. Choosing where to put what buildings, how you group your districts, which things you choose to include or exclude, fuel your own ideas for how the city functions, what life is really like within this world. Maybe you don't see it as a dystopia. Maybe it's just a more futuristic version of a modern city. Maybe the whole thing leans more towards a utopia instead, where poverty and crime have been reduced to a minimum, if they're present at all. There are other ways to have zero narrative while also still trying to convey some sense of story, even if the game itself doesn't directly present one. The Backrooms is a whole series of games made by a million different developers, and I mean, you could talk about almost any of them in this section. The whole genre stems from a 4chan post based on a series of photos from a hobby shop, but because the lore is so incredibly decentralized, the whole thing is kind of predicated on the fact that you've already seen some number of either games or videos or wikis or what have you, in order to build up a vague repository of information.
A specific guide is almost always unnecessary. There are a couple details that tend to remain the same from piece to piece. Obviously, these endless yellow hallways and the whole idea of liminal spaces are pretty constant. But aside from that, you could create just about anything within the space as long as you justify it. Monsters are a common occurrence, and there are a number of them that are fairly common among different interpretations, such as these smiley fuckers.
Because of this sprawling and diverse lore, several of these projects just assume that you have some existing knowledge about the series and largely try to build on the experience from there. For our discussion, I'd like to talk about pools. I haven't played a ton of Backrooms games, nor am I overly familiar with the content as a whole, but the ambiance has always appealed to me. And that's essentially all this game is. The whole thing takes place over 5 levels, all of which center around the pools area of the Backrooms. There's no enemies to encounter, no monsters to run from. Just you, your camera, and the unsettling ambiance of this place and the knowledge that you are totally alone with no apparent way out. The whole game is a walking simulator if ever there was one. Yet, again, in spite of an apparent lack of story, there's still a great deal of context here, provided you understand the lore to a degree. The original 4chan post mentions that people end up in this place when they no-clip out of reality, a term borrowed from gaming, borrowing its name from the idea that someone or something has no collision with other objects, allowing it to just clip through everything. This means that we have essentially fallen out of reality and ended up in this place for seemingly no discernible reason, only to try and work our way out of here, exploring absurdist environments that bear a passing resemblance to our reality, yet are still fundamentally not of our world. They still follow the laws of physics as we understand them, but their construction defies reason. Things are built for no seeming purpose, sprawling in every direction. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have games that are almost entirely stories, to the point where you're not really given any true control, only able to view the narrative as it's presented to you. The classic example I think of is What Remains of Edith Finch, a game where your involvement in the story is largely just exploring the world around you. There's nothing you can do to actually change the outcome of the story, aside from choosing to stop playing. You could technically make a movie about Edith Finch, the story is roughly the appropriate length to do so, but in doing so you'd lose the ability to interact with the world, which is what I think makes the game so good in the first place. The story centers around Edith Finch exploring the abandoned home of her great-grandmother, also named Edith. The game is a collection of smaller stories about all the death surrounding the Finch family, who Edie, your great-grandmother, believes is cursed. The story would definitely lose some of its impact if you were to take away the interactive elements. I think the best example of this comes in the form of Lewis's story near the end of the game. Edith's brother Lewis works at a dead-end job in a tuna factory, and sought to escape that by creating a whole fictional world in his head in order to do so. You take control of him as he's working, spending his time daydreaming while mindlessly cutting the heads of fish off. As you play through this world, it gets more and more elaborate. It takes up more of the screen, and it becomes harder to even tell where the guillotine actually is. Your attention is split between the fish and the world in your mind, though this split becomes less and less symmetrical very quickly. Eventually, the job vanishes entirely, and Lewis is completely engrossed in the world he created, before he decides to join it forever. This is the kind of thing that you can't get in a movie. This is why What Remains of Edith Finch is a video game, even if it's the bare minimum of what a game should entail. The game may be a straight line, but there are still small pathways that stem off from the trail. They just don't go very far. One brief thing I also wanted to mention here was the role that achievements can play in conveying a game's story. Achievements are, first and foremost, rewards for completing various milestones within a game, as decided on by its developers. Some games, like Subnautica, have achievements that you will obtain by simply just visiting the various landmark moments of the story. By completing the game here, you'll have earned all but one of the game's achievements. Other games can also use them to mark some accomplishments that are more out there in nature, such as finding all of a given collectible or performing a difficult or absurd feat. These kinds of achievements in particular are what I want to focus on. Services like Steam often have little footnotes accompanying a given achievement, telling you some kind of indicator of what you need to do in order to unlock it. This gives players a reason to go back through the game with a fine-tooth comb. It's an excuse to replay something that you might not replay otherwise. What Remains of Edith Finch has no replay value, unless you want to relive the story. It's like a movie in that regard. But being given an excuse to go back through the game gives you the context to look deeper at the narrative. Try and get a better understanding now that you're playing the game with a full deck of cards. You don't need to focus on the big picture as much anymore. While we're on the subject of story-focused games, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about Telltale. Now, cards on the table. I've never played a Telltale game, but I am familiar with them.
Their tried-and-true formula was a choices matter, choose-your-own-adventure style of gameplay, which is something that I'm personally familiar with.
They were best known for their collaborations with other IPs, such as The Walking Dead, Borderlands, and the Patton Oswalt game. This formula worked for them for a long time, until it didn't. But to say that it stopped working wouldn't really be true. For the sake of my own understanding, let's shift our focus to something I'm more familiar with. Let's talk about Detroit Become Human. I was late to the party on this game by virtue of not owning a PlayStation. That's just personal world building for you all, and not relevant to our discussion though. In a similar vein to Edith Finch, the game is almost entirely centered around the narrative. I mean, the game's difficulty setting just changes how many buttons the game will choose from when you perform QuickTime events. The difference here is that instead of being one singular pathway, the story is a series of paths, like the branches of a large tree. The script for this game is some 2,000 pages long, and playing through the game even just 2 times, making wildly different choices each time, it's clear to see why this is the case. It's no surprise that a game almost completely rooted in dialogue has a lot of words in it, but it's also because the endings do get pretty diverse. There's a large swath of the game I've never played simply because I don't have it in me to pick the bad options in video games. I mean, honestly, gun to my head, you just have to shoot me. I can't kill this Chloe bot Kamsky. Choose your own adventure style games are fun not just because of the level of control they give the player, but in how much they let you tell an unconventional narrative.
I know that I've finished a game before and often wondered how things would have turned out differently if I had made the non-heroic choices. What if blank was evil was a common enough question that countless fanfictions have been written to tackle this exact thing from a litany of groups. Except in most cases the creator of these pieces are speculating as to the nature of these results. Their ideas are usually based on a competent understanding of the character, but the jumping point is still so wide that almost all of the time you are speculating.
Detroit Become Human decided to answer that question for you. If you'd like to know what would happen if Connor didn't waver in his mission, become deviant, and help the androids earn their freedom, as well as help his partner Hank to overcome his misplaced anger at the death of his son, well, you can. And it's grim.
For his efforts, Connor is replaced, upgraded with the latest model. There's no ceremony here, no honor. You're a machine, and when the technology improves, you build a better one. That's all there is to it. I saw someone liken it to Connor's legacy continuing on, but I disagree. The game pretty heavily implies that nothing about our Connor will be kept. Amanda refers to him as obsolete. There is no legacy, only the upgrade.
The point of all these endings isn't just to be different flavors of the same thing. It's to have a true discussion about the merits of his decision-making. You're unhappy with the fact that Connor is replaced for completing his mission? Good! That's the point. Of course, the game does also deal in different flavors of the same ending too. You can have a varied experience depending on which characters you manage to save, which I think gives the game more texture in that regard.
Sure. The happiest ending is one where you save and free all the androids, but is that really accurate to real life? My first time through the game, I got Luther killed at Jericho, and because I shot Todd in Act 1, I couldn't use him to get free bus tickets without stealing them from the family, so instead I had to cross the river with Rose. This caused me to learn the hard way that no matter what you do, Somebody dies here. This last act of hardship does not come freely. There will always be a cost to pay. And yeah, it's dark and sad, but it's powerful and effective.
I don't actually want to litigate the contents of the story here, as that's a subject that I am ill-equipped to broach. But I would be remiss if I was going to talk at length about this game and not mention the dubious nature of the man credited as its writer. How good the writing actually is would be a topic for a completely different video, but on a fundamental level I would argue that the game accomplished what it set out to do. The story is, in fact, incredibly sprawling. Your choices have meaningful and tangible outcomes that shape the story in a way that is meaningful and different at the very least. There are a lot of games that tout themselves as your choices matter style games, but when you really boil it down, you might end up changing a handful of characters who appear in the game's final cutscene. The most prominent example of this in my mind is Assassin's Creed Odyssey. The game pretty quickly tries to explain to you that your choices matter in this game. I mean, it flat out says this with all the subtlety of a freight train. It can't even do the stupid little "this action will have consequences" thing from Life is Strange. This game has you make a ton of choices, but to say that any of them really matter is almost laughable.
A quick example comes early on when you confront your father, being given the option to kill him or not. This seems like a pretty meaningful change, but, and I shit you not, the only thing it changes is whether or not you are forced to kill another character later on in the story. He also doesn't fucking matter. This game is not really equipped to handle significant choices. It has to take into account the fact that you could choose either of the two options, and so as a result, the functionality of your father surviving the story is basically none.
This game is not really equipped to handle actual significant choices, so it has to account for the fact that you could pick either option in basically every scenario. Actually thinking about the ramifications of sparing him would make this game less of an open-world RPG. At the end of the game, you can finally sit down with your reunited family. Or not, depending on how many of them you opted to kill. The only one who will unequivocally make it through is your mother, so it can be a pretty shit family dinner. At least she didn't try and kill me. Where were we again? Oh, right, Detroit. Do I like Detroit? Yes. I think the game's framework is really solid, that what you do actually matters, even if the writing is not stellar. David Cage is another beast entirely that I just do not want to tackle, but it's clear that there is a good structure here worth exploring, and that's what the entire video has been about. While we're still on the subject of choose-your-own-adventure style games, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least cover Dispatch for a moment. Dispatch blurs the lines of being a video game even harder than Detroit or even What Remains of Edith Finch does, as you have a bare minimum amount of control during the game. There's no 3D world to explore here. You play as Robert Robertson III, otherwise known as Mecha Man, but you don't really control him. You can choose which dialogue option he says during conversations, and depending on your settings, you can even interact during QuickTime events, but the game is on the tightest rails you can have while also still calling this a game. As funny as I think it is to say this, I think this is actually an improvement for the genre. I think in some regards it does cut a lot of the fluff out of games like Detroit and Life is Strange. You consolidate the pace of the game down to the important scenes that people care about. It also means that you're allowed to pre-render all the cutscenes. Very handy indeed. I kinda already broached this already, but I would say that most games languish somewhere in the middle when it comes to their narrative. Open world RPGs are the biggest offenders. I feel like a lot of these plots are just a vehicle to have the player explore the world. I talked about the issue of urgency in the Cyberpunk video essay, but it's worth restating here that the issue with open world games is that you either have to have a plot that admits it's not time sensitive, or just make your players accept that suspension of disbelief. If your plan is to give them absolute freedom, then restricting them by imposing a deadline would mean that you likely won't have a chance to explore the entirety of the setting. Taking another look at Subnautica again, you become trapped on this oceanic planet because we're infected with a virus, and the entire planet is quarantined because of a massive defense grid. The only way to shut it off is to cure yourself to pass the scan. Of course, all the infection stages are trigger points that the game inflicts on you. If you opt to just sit around in the escape pod or the Aurora or your base, you won't ever get a game over. It's largely just the sacrifice that has to be paid to attempt to merge these two aspects together. Of course, this is not a hard and fast rule. Open world games with lower stakes can get away with letting you free roam. The first act of many of these games functions exactly this way. Skyrim comes kinda close. Before you realize that it's Alduin who attacked Helgen, the situation isn't so dire that a dragon attack would warrant urgent attention. The main thing of note is that dragons have been dead for a good while, but finding one or two stragglers could still be feasible. This is also the logic that 70% of your average Pokemon game operates off of, or 90% of Sword and Shield. Somewhere in all this, there's a middle ground. The player has a finite amount of space to explore a given area, but there's still heavy restrictions on where someone can go. The first thing that comes to mind is Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. It's by no means a prominent example for any specific reason, it's just the one I've played the most recently. Indy is actively racing another archaeologist to solve a groundbreaking discovery, so time is definitely of the essence here. Each location is pretty self-contained, which means you're not incentivized to traverse the whole map to see what the world has to offer. By following the main mission, you'll still end up seeing most of, if not all of, the world of the game. There are still side quests you can complete, but they're much less essential than side missions in other games. This is the realm I think most stories tend to lie in. It's the easiest compromise between the developer and the player in terms of what freedom means in a video game. Of course, time doesn't have to be a factor in your story, at least not when it comes to the idea of urgency. The Longing is a fascinating exercise in the exact opposite of what I've been talking about. Time is an important factor, but that's because the game is on a different kind of timetable. You play as this little guy, who needs to wait 400 real-life days for the king to wake back up. You could simply choose to wait all that time, but you can also make it pass faster by performing a number of actions in the playable area, like reading. The pace of the game is slow, leaving the player to linger in the moment as they walk from place to place. Similarly, Far Cry 4 features a hidden ending that is dependent on the player being patient enough to see it through. In the very opening of the game, if you wait 10-ish minutes when Pagan Min leaves to take his phone call, he'll actually come back and help you leave your mother's ashes at the shrine to Lakshmana, thereby skipping the entire game in the process. Of course, in doing this, you're essentially letting Pagan get away with everything he does and everything he will do, but it's a fascinating ending to me because of how much it contrasts the genre that it lives in. I've never played Far Cry 4, or any game in the franchise for that matter, but this ending has still been stuck in my head for somewhere close to 10 years, because of how unorthodox it is. It's a complete and total subversion of the narrative, as well as the characterization you likely have of Pagan at this time, given the fact that he stabs a man right before this. Now, this essay is actually about a specific game, and we'll talk about it in a second. But the reason I wanted to talk about most of this is because the decision to tell a story, to have a story, almost always involves narration or dialogue. Given that it's the primary way humans communicate, this largely goes without saying. It can take multiple forms in games. For the longest time, games that wanted to have stories conveyed all of it through text on screen, leaving all nuance of dialogue to the player, inflection, tone, pacing, etc. More storage eventually gives way to better tech, which leads to voice acting in games, among other additions that were heretofore not possible. The size of games balloons exponentially. Where games were once so compact you could run them on almost anything, nowadays most major titles struggle to live under 10 gigabytes, and most AAA games can't crack sub 50. I'm getting off topic. I discovered Gris while browsing the Steam store. I was drawn to the visual style of the game. I love the hand-drawn feel that it depicted, and I have a fascination with that astrological and circular aesthetic that the game appeared to have. What I expected from the game was a visually interesting walking simulator a la Pools, presented in 2D form rather than a 3D environment. What I was treated to was a game that conveys a very real and emotional story, the journey of this girl to understand the loss of a loved one, the struggle to cope with that, and all while having no dialogue of any kind, written or spoken. This game takes about 3 hours to complete for the casual player, that's how long it took me at least, and during that time not a single word will be spoken to you, the player. Not by the protagonist, not by the soundtrack, not visually on the screen, nothing. The game manages to convey to you the story without ever needing to say a word, and I think there's something impressive about that. Now, I'll go ahead and issue a spoiler warning out of courtesy, but I'm also going to argue that I don't think it's necessary. The game's store page conveys the plot pretty much in its entirety. I say plot, but that's definitely not the right word. The game is a journey more than anything. It's an experience. I still want to encourage anyone to play this game for themselves, as I think it's more fun than just listening to me talk about it, but if you do decide to play it, please come back. I still want you all to hear me talk about it. While I can't spoil the story, I do have to go over the game's mechanics, not because I'm interested in talking about the game on a technical level, but because the mechanics are intrinsically linked to the narrative. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about the game in earnest. Gris is, obviously, a game about overcoming grief and loss. The game starts with the protagonist resting in the hand of this large statue, singing. We then watch as the statue crumbles into nothing, sending us cascading into a colorless abyss, leaving us in an endless plain, devoid of color. Our character can barely walk, much less be able to continue to sing. This is a pretty direct, albeit effective metaphor, and it immediately lays out for us the kind of journey we're about to go on. I think the point is really cemented though when we stumble upon the hand of the statue in this endless void. Stepping into the hand causes our character to begin to levitate, and we watch as the world begins to be painted with the color red, texturing everything from the ground to the sky with watercolor brushstrokes of reds of different intensities. The 5 stages of grief are the game's central theme, and they manifest in a couple of different ways. The first, and most obvious, is the colors. Interpreting the game's initial prologue as the beginning of the main character's grief, and their fall specifically, would make this first section denial. The world begins the game totally devoid of all color. The immediate aftermath of loss is a total shutdown of feeling, that denial of processing your feelings. Gris chooses to instead simply exist, hollow and unfeeling. It's no coincidence then that the first color we encounter when exploring this world is red. The second stage of grief is usually described as anger. In addition to that, each stage will give our main character some new power. The first power we get is the ability to turn into a stone. Throughout the remainder of the game, we will use this power to break through cracked stone objects in order to progress. It's far and away the most destructive power that we will come to possess. In keeping with our 5 stages of grief theming, the game is divided into 5 areas that we have to explore in order to complete the game. The one place I think this game diverges a little from their theme of the 5 stages is right here, as while the stages are usually presented in a specific order, that's not to say that you have to experience them in exactly that order. There's a whole rabbit hole we could fall down talking about the original 5 stages of death concept by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, but the point is that the games make us complete the stages in the exact order presented. This is also somewhat interesting because the game features a hub world, but doesn't let you tackle the stages in any order. So let's talk about the gameplay part of this game for a second. The game is a low-stakes platformer in which our main objective is to simply complete each area. The most notable thing we can do is collect these mementos. They do not inherently do anything by themselves, but there is a reason to collect every single one, so I made sure to get all of them. The main way to progress in the game is to collect these little stars. We'll often have to form constellations to either gain new powers or access the next area. Once we complete a level, all the stars we collected are deposited into one massive constellation in the sky. Another side objective the game has is that many of the levels feature a statue that represents one of the stages of grief. Interacting with it in a specific manner will reward you with its corresponding achievement. Most of these statues are pretty easy to miss, and what you're supposed to do with them is not inherently clear. A little confusing from a gameplay perspective, but it makes perfect sense to me given the narrative. Figuring out how to deal with your grief is something that never goes away, and rarely gets easier. It's largely something that you'll just have to live with for your entire life. Scars may recede some, but they rarely go away. The game represents this too, in a different manner. We explore each section and bring back color to the world of the game, and the hub becomes ever more vibrant and alive. But it never really returns to its former glory. Even in the very final section of the game, you can still see the places where the structure has cracked and fallen away. It's more complete than it was when the game started, but you can't ever put the pieces back together. The game's main antagonist is this big bird goo monster, the very manifestation of grief itself. It never actually physically harms us, but it constantly tries to hinder our progress and ends up causing more damage in that way. It also proves capable of changing forms. Grief is not bound to simply one expression. It manifests itself in different ways. Grief most prominently takes the bird form, but it also shows up as an eel as well as just a nebulous blob, and even the face of our mother towards the end of the game. grief literally swallows us whole, forcing us to either sink or swim. Having regained the ability to sing again over the course of the game, we find ourselves in the hand of the broken statue, the hand of our mother, surrounded by grief, almost drowning in it, and choose to sing. Choosing to use that connection, that bond, is the act that allows us to move on. Remembrance doesn't mean harboring that pain forever. It's the conscious effort to choose not to forget. Even without the achievement system helping to explain the game's motifs, I think you could still get a full understanding of the narrative without being given those hints. The game wants you to pay attention. It wants you to collect the mementos in each level, and doing so entices you to check everywhere and pay attention to everything. It makes you more of an active observer, and the fantastic score helps draw you in during cutscenes. Collecting all of the mementos allows you to play an otherwise unavailable cutscene where we see the mother in non-statue form, sharing a beautiful experience with our character. I think you could probably guess that the statue is the protagonist's mother, but this scene removes any doubt in my mind about that. As a child, I was drawn to video games for the interactivity. It was a distraction that offered an experience unlike any other I had available to me at the time. Growing up in the middle of nowhere as an only child didn't offer me a lot of chances to socialize with other kids outside of school, so a lot of my home life consisted of playing games and watching TV. That interest in media propelled me to where I am today, and it also changed what it is about games that I find so enticing. Games are a medium that offer stories that allow for discovery and exploration in ways that things like movies or books simply can't. It's hard to get someone to explore a book outside of reading it. But a game can reward players who are invested enough to find out the deeper lore by scattering bits and pieces of it around the playable area. Games have not always had the most complex or compelling narrative over the years, but I think that we're always moving closer and closer to that becoming true. There's a reason we've been seeing so many adaptations of games into TV shows as of late. There is no perfect medium for storytelling, because it relies so heavily on the individual partaking in it. I love reading, but I know that many people do not, for one reason or another. No, there is no perfect medium. But when games work, when they tell a story that I find compelling, there's a level of satisfaction I get, and you just can't get that anywhere else. And that's why I love the medium so much today.